New York City, September 1968. The offices of Atlantic Records occupied 3 floors of a glass tower on Broadway. Gold records lined the mahogany walls like trophies. Aretha Franklin, Otis Redding, Ray Charles, Wilson Pickett. Names that had made the label legendary. Artists who had built fortunes for the men in suits who controlled their destinies. Richard Steinberg sat behind his mahogany desk on the 18th floor, reviewing contracts with surgical precision, calculating profits, deciding which dreams lived and which died. At 52, he was one of the most powerful executives in the music industry, a man who had climbed from the mailroom by understanding one truth. Music was product, and products existed to generate revenue. His office was a monument to success. Persian rugs commanding city views, expensive bourbon. Everything positioned to remind visitors of their place. What Steinberg wanted happened. What he didn't want disappeared. It was that simple. It had always been that simple. He'd been watching Jimi Hendrix's rise with calculating interest. The kid from Seattle had talent, no question. But talent wasn't enough. You needed backing, distribution, promotion. You needed men like Richard Steinberg to open doors. And right now, Jimi needed something only Steinberg could provide. His secretary knocked. "Mr. Hendrix is here for his 3 o'clock. Send him in." Jimi entered wearing a purple velvet jacket that absorbed the afternoon light. His afro was perfectly shaped, creating a crown-like silhouette despite his obvious nervousness. His guitar case, worn leather with travel stickers, hung from his shoulder. He moved quietly, hesitantly, clearly aware he was crossing into foreign territory. The power dynamics were immediately apparent. This was Steinberg's world, governed by his rules. Every element reinforced the hierarchy. The visitor's chair positioned lower, the massive desk, the intimidating wall of gold records. "Mr. Hendrix." Steinberg didn't stand up, didn't offer his hand. "Please sit." Jimi sat in the chair across from the desk. The chair was positioned lower than Steinberg's, a psychological advantage that Steinberg had calculated precisely. "I've been listening to your work," Steinberg said, picking up a vinyl copy of Are You Experienced? "Impressive, very impressive. You have a unique sound." "Thank you, sir." "The question is commercial viability. Can this sound translate to radio? Can Middle America embrace it? That's what determines success in this industry." Steinberg opened Jimi's file. Inside were promotional photos, press clippings, and something more important: personal background information, family history, the kind of research Steinberg always conducted before important meetings. "I see here you're from Seattle. Father in the military, mother—" He paused reading. "Lucille, died when you were 15. Something shifted in Jimi's posture. Almost imperceptible, but Steinberg noticed. He'd found a pressure point. "Alcoholism," Steinberg continued, his voice maintaining the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to discuss quarterly earnings or market projections. "According to my research, it was a prolonged struggle. Started when you were young, got worse over time. Common story in your community, really. Single mothers, economic pressure, limited opportunities, broken families, absent parents, children essentially raising themselves on the streets while their mothers pursue temporary escape in bottles." Jimi's hands remained folded in his lap, but Steinberg's predatory instincts caught the subtle change. Knuckles gone white, shoulders slightly more rigid, breathing more controlled. "The sociological patterns are quite predictable," Steinberg continued, warming to his theme like a professor delivering a lecture. "Economic disadvantage leads to despair. Despair leads to substance abuse. Substance abuse leads to family breakdown. It's a cycle we see repeated in urban communities across the country. Nothing personal, you understand. Just demographics. Here's what concerns me," Steinberg said, leaning back in his leather chair. "The market research shows that white audiences, and they're still the majority of record buyers, they want authenticity, but not too much reality. They want blues that sound exotic, not blues that sound like actual poverty." He closed the file. "Your background, your mother's problems, the circumstances of her death, that's a little too real, a little too predictable. They die like they all do in those neighborhoods, drinking themselves to death, leaving their kids to figure it out alone." The office went very quiet. Outside, traffic moved 20 stories below. Inside, Jimmy sat perfectly still. I'm not being cruel, Steinberg continued. I'm being realistic. This is business. We need to craft a narrative that's palatable. Your mother's story, the alcoholism, the abandonment, the stereotypical tragedy, that's not marketable. That's not what sells records. Steinberg pulled out a contract. I'm prepared to offer you a deal. 3 albums, significant promotion budget, national distribution, but the story has to change. Your mother's memory gets rewritten for mass consumption. He slid the contract across the desk. What do you say? Jimmy looked at the contract, looked at Steinberg. His expression was unreadable. Finally, he spoke. Can I use your piano? Steinberg blinked. Excuse me? You have a piano in the corner. Can I use it? I don't see how that's relevant to... Just for a minute, sir. Please. Something in Jimmy's voice made Steinberg pause. Not aggressive, not angry, just quiet certainty. Fine. But then we need to... Jimmy stood up and walked to the upright piano in the corner of the office. It was there for decoration mostly, a symbol of Steinberg's connection to the music industry. He'd had it tuned once in 5 years. Jimmy sat at the bench and placed his long, elegant fingers on the yellowed ivory keys. He pressed down gently, testing the touch, listening to the tone with the focused attention of a surgeon examining a patient. The piano was surprisingly well maintained despite Steinberg's neglect, its voice rich and full in the acoustically treated office. Then he began to play. The melody emerged slowly, like dawn breaking over still water. Simple at first, just single notes played with infinite care, each one allowed to ring fully before the next one joined it. The harmonies were complex but felt inevitable, as if they'd always existed and Jimmy was merely discovering them. It sounded like a church hymn, something that carried the weight of generations, something that spoke of Sunday mornings and worn pews and voices raised in desperate hope. Then he began to sing. His voice was completely different from his recordings. Softer, more vulnerable, stripped of all the power and aggression that made him famous. The words painted a picture of a woman who worked double shifts cleaning office buildings, who came home with aching hands and tired eyes to children who needed more than she could give. About nights when the pain became too much and bottles offered temporary mercy. But mostly, the song was about love that persisted through addiction, through poverty, through circumstances that would have broken weaker spirits. She used to sing to me, Jimmy said quietly, his voice floating over the piano melody like smoke. When I was small, maybe 4 or 5, before the drinking got bad. She'd come home from those cleaning jobs, her hands raw from industrial soap, and she'd sit at an old upright piano we had. Nothing fancy, missing half the ivory on the keys. And she'd play church songs her grandmother had taught her back in Georgia. His fingers moved across the keys with impossible gentleness, as if the instrument were made of butterfly wings. Her voice was beautiful, Mr. Steinberg. Even when she was exhausted, even when her spirit was breaking under the weight of trying to keep us fed and housed, it was still beautiful. She'd sing old spirituals, hymns about freedom and redemption, and for those few minutes, our little apartment felt like a sanctuary instead of a prison. She didn't choose addiction, Mr. Steinberg. Addiction chose her, but she was still my mother, still loved me, still protected me when she could, still deserves to be remembered as more than a stereotype. The melody changed, became more complex. Jazz chords, gospel runs, techniques that suggested serious training. This is for her, for Lucille, for the woman she was, not the way she died. The song built to a climax that made Steinberg's chest tight. Then it resolved into silence. Complete silence. Jimmy stood up from the piano bench. I won't sign anything that dishonors her memory. He picked up his guitar case. But thank you for your time, Mr. Steinberg. Wait. Steinberg's voice came out rougher than he intended. That song, what was it? Something I wrote for her. Years ago. Never recorded it. Never played it for anyone. It's, Steinberg struggled for words. It's beautiful. She was beautiful, even at the end. Especially at the end. Jimmy walked toward the door. Mr. Hendrix. Steinberg stood up. For the first time in the meeting, he was the one who looked uncertain. I spoke inappropriately about your mother. I was wrong. Jimmy paused at the door. She wasn't a statistic, Steinberg continued. I treated her like one. That was disrespectful. To her memory, to you, to everyone dealing with these situations. Yes, it was. Would you, would you consider coming back? We could discuss terms that don't require changing your story. Your real story. Jimmy turned around. Why? Because what you just played showed me something I'd forgotten. Music isn't about market research. It's about truth. And your truth, all of it, including the painful parts, that's what makes you extraordinary. Jimmy set his guitar case down. You want to hear more about my mother? I want to hear whatever you want to tell me. They talked for 3 more hours as Manhattan's afternoon faded into evening outside the windows. About Lucille, about addiction as a disease rather than a moral failing, about the difference between sympathy and understanding, about families that love each other through impossible circumstances, about the weight of carrying someone's memory, about the responsibility that comes with having platforms to tell stories. Steinberg found himself sharing things he'd never told business associates, vulnerabilities he'd kept hidden for decades. About his own father, a tailor who'd worked 16-hour days to afford his son's college education, dying of a heart attack at 53 without ever seeing Steinberg graduate. About his mother, who'd sacrificed her own dreams of teaching school so the family could survive his father's early death. About the guilt he carried from becoming successful in an industry that often profited from other people's pain. I think I became everything I swore I wouldn't become, Steinberg admitted as the conversation deepened. When I started in this business, I wanted to help artists tell their stories. Somewhere along the way, I started deciding which stories were worth telling. It happens, Jimmy said without judgment. Success has its own gravity, pulls you away from what you used to believe. How do you stay connected to it, to what matters? I play her song, Jimmy replied simply. Every night before I go to sleep, I play something for her. Reminds me why I started making music in the first place. Not for fame or money, but because she showed me that music could heal pain, even when it couldn't cure it. When Jimmy left that evening, he'd signed a contract. But more importantly, Steinberg had torn up the marketing plan that would have sanitized Jimmy's biography. The album they made together 6 months later included the song Jimmy had played on the piano. Letter to Lucille. It never became a hit single, but it became legendary among musicians. A song about addiction that didn't judge, about poverty that didn't pity, about love that transcended circumstances. 20 years later, in 1988, Steinberg was interviewed for a documentary about Jimi Hendrix. The interviewer asked about their first meeting. I was an arrogant man, Steinberg said. I thought I understood the music business, understood what people wanted, understood how to package artists for success. Then Jimmy played that song for his mother, and I realized I understood nothing. What did you learn? That authenticity can't be manufactured. That pain is not a marketing problem to be solved. That some stories are too important to be changed for commercial reasons. Do you regret how you initially approached him? Steinberg was quiet for a long moment. I regret many things about that meeting, but I'm grateful it happened, because it changed how I saw music, how I saw artists, how I saw people dealing with difficult circumstances. He paused. Jimmy taught me that everyone's mother deserves to be remembered with dignity. Everyone's story deserves to be told truthfully. Everyone's pain deserves respect. Even though respecting those stories might mean smaller profits, especially then, because that's when respect matters most. When Jimmy died in 1970, Steinberg was at the funeral. He sat in the back quietly. After the service, he approached Jimmy's father. Your son honored your wife's memory, he told Al Hendrix. He made sure the world knew Lucille was more than her struggles. He made sure she was remembered as a whole person. Al Hendrix nodded, tears in his eyes. That's all she would have wanted, just to be remembered as more than how she died. She is, Steinberg said. Because of him, she always will be. The music industry has changed since 1968, but the lesson from that September afternoon remains the same. Power without compassion is just bullying. Success without respect for people's stories is just exploitation. And sometimes the quietest responses are the most devastating. Jimi Hendrix could have signed that contract, could have let his mother's memory be sanitized for commercial success, Could have chosen career advancement over family dignity, but he didn't. He chose love. He chose truth. He chose to honor the woman who sang to him at an old upright piano, even when honoring her meant risking his future. That's the real story of that day. Not about business negotiations or contract terms or market positioning, but about a son's uncompromising love for his mother, about refusing to let anyone, regardless of their power or position in society's hierarchy, reduce the people you love to convenient stereotypes or profitable statistics. Richard Steinberg walked into that meeting believing he held all the cards. He had wealth, connections, industry influence, the demonstrated ability to make or break careers with a single decision. His office was designed to reinforce that power, every element calculated to make visitors feel smaller, more dependent on his approval. But when Jimmy sat at that piano and sang about Lucille with such tenderness and unwavering respect, the entire power dynamic shifted irrevocably. In 3 minutes of music, Jimmy revealed that there were forms of strength that money couldn't buy, forms of authority that didn't depend on corporate hierarchies, forms of power that came from love rather than fear. Steinberg had wealth and influence and the ability to control careers, but Jimmy had something infinitely more powerful: the unshakable conviction that his mother's memory mattered more than any record deal, any amount of commercial success, any compromise with an industry that demanded he betray the people who shaped him. That conviction didn't just change Richard Steinberg, though it did that completely and permanently. It changed Atlantic Records' approach to artist development, forcing them to confront their own assumptions about which stories deserved to be told and which ones needed to be sanitized for mass consumption. It changed how an entire industry thought about the relationship between authenticity and commercial viability. But most importantly, it preserved something precious and irreplaceable: a mother's dignity. Lucille Hendrix, who died too young and in too much pain, who struggled with demons she couldn't defeat, who loved her children with a fierce tenderness that survived even her worst moments. She was remembered not as a cautionary tale or a sociological statistic, but as a complete human being worthy of respect and love. One quiet song, one refusal to compromise on what mattered most, one son's love for his mother, expressed with such power that it moved mountains of prejudice and indifference. That was enough to change everything. And sometimes that's all it takes.